My name is Lauren Lobdell. I lead the client services team for Tutor.com, and it has been my pleasure to help moderate these sessions and run the Q&A, working with my esteemed colleague, Dr. Amy Dietzman, who is our subject matter expert on these topics and who has been providing us with wonderful tips that help you, whether you're a student, you're a parent, you're a teacher, you're a mentor or a coach, or even somebody like myself who actually took a lot of gleanings from these sessions and I use them in my job, in my career. So I think there's a little bit of something for everyone here in this session, despite the topic being called student success. So while we're ending this series, we are very excited to be thinking about and kind of incubating some ideas for some upcoming series in the future. So Amy, I'm going to pass it to you to take it away with this session, and then I'll be back for you guys at the end of the presentation for Amy and I to have a bit of Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Lauren. So hi, everybody. I am Amy Dietzman. I think a lot of you on this call have probably attended my other webinars, so I'm not going to talk about myself too much. I just want to say, as we round out this student success series of webinars, I want to thank you all for being here and listening and for asking such thoughtful questions. Some of you have reached out to share how these webinars have helped you, and I feel so grateful to have been able to spend this time with you. The objectives for this webinar are to think critically about critical thinking. Well, not really, because that doesn't really mean anything, but we're actually going to talk about what critical thinking is and how we can become critical thinkers. We're going to talk about finding sources for our research, identifying assumptions and biases and how they can influence our research, and we will talk about the all-important subject, academic integrity and plagiarism. Now, I must preface all of this by saying, we are living in a divisive political climate right now, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about might seem like I'm addressing issues that we're facing in politics. And I just want to assure you that while you can draw a lot of parallels and connect all of this to those kinds of issues, what I'm really talking about remains relevant after the election. It's all about how you find and analyze sources and how you determine what your own thought processes are when you're looking at research. So I'm not going political is what I'm trying to say. So what is critical thinking? Well, critical thinking is the objective analysis and evaluation of facts to form a judgment. So let's just pull it apart a little bit. Important words here are analysis and evaluation of facts. A lot of people think it is in our nature to think critically, but I actually posit to you that most of us tend to believe the things that we hear and see without always asking what's the truth. Much of our thinking, left to itself, is biased, distorted, partial, uninformed, and sometimes prejudiced. Yet the quality of our life and that of what we produce depends precisely on the quality of our thought. So excellence in thought, however, must be systematically cultivated. It's not natural. And that's why it's important for us to be educated. And I mean educated about issues, but also, going back to school, getting educated, which probably everyone on this call is doing in some way or another. So what does it take to be a critical thinker? Now, these are all reasons to think critically in our everyday lives, but how does critical thinking lead us to be better students and maybe better writers? A lot of what we're talking about today is going to relate to writing. So a critical thinker raises vital questions and problems. A critical thinker gathers and assesses relevant information. A critical thinker effectively comes to well-reasoned conclusions and solutions. A critical thinker thinks open-mindedly within alternative systems of thought. And a critical thinker recognizes and assesses assumptions, implications, and practical consequences. A lot of words there. And a critical thinker communicates effectively with others. So have you ever had a debate with someone who is super well-read and informed? Maybe you immediately realized you were just out of your league with this person because while you thought you knew a lot, you realized that you didn't compared to them. You might notice that a person like this is open to talking and wants to hear your perspective. What made that person a critical thinker? If you look at all of these things on the screen. Alternatively, have you ever had a debate or an argument with someone that based everything they said on hearsay and became very emotional? You probably could say exactly what that person was missing in terms of clarity in their thought process. You may have noticed that this person was not open to hearing your opinion and was probably not a great communicator. And you've also probably had a conversation with a know-it-all who wouldn't listen to anyone. And where does this person fall in the scale of critical thinking? Where do you prefer to fall? So part of being a critical thinker is knowing your own assumptions. And I'll admit that in this day and age, I've seen things on the news before and thought, really, did that happen? And my instinct is to believe it, but I've had to remind myself to go to the internet and look for proof. Are there pictures? Is there a video? Who else is saying the same thing? Dare I say, is Fox News and CNN both telling the same story? Probably not. Identifying our assumptions is a first step to knowing what baggage we are all carrying into our research. Sometimes we can have assumptions about things and we just don't even realize it. So when I was in college, I did a speech on the glass ceiling and how women don't make the same as men doing the same jobs. I did this in the 90s, and you've probably heard this story. It's still going on out there. And I'm so passionate about it. It was something new to me. I'd never heard it, and I don't know how I found it, but I just got so excited. And I was sitting in the library, looking at books back in the day, and I did my research, and I thought I had this thing nailed. I was going to get an A+. But my professor hated it. She said my presentation was completely biased and not objective. And I remember thinking, how does this woman not like a speech about women? But what she was trying to teach me was to present my facts objectively and without bias. Maybe my assignment, if it had been about trying to persuade, it would have been okay, but that was not the assignment. Presenting an argument is not the same thing as persuasion. An argument is based on facts and usually presents both sides. Persuasion is more about your personal opinion and is generally one-sided. There is a time and place for persuasion, but beware, it's not used as often as argument. And if you are a parent to a K-12 student or you are a K-12 student in this webinar right now, let me just point out that persuasion is less and less present in K-12 curriculum now. It's all about argument. We're teaching even our children at a young age to understand the difference between this is what I think and this is what I know based on facts and research, and here's both sides. So you can see why this is an important topic. As critical thinkers, we need to identify and evaluate our assumptions before we accept something as truth. We need to follow an argument to its conclusion. I think of how sometimes I read a headline for a news story and I don't read the whole article. Sometimes the headline is deceiving. Sometimes it's attention-getting. Sometimes it's not really what the article is about. So we need to follow an argument to its conclusion, and that means we read the whole article and others like it. Spot contradictions and faulty logic. This means that we can see when things don't necessarily add up. I'll give you an example. There was a recent article that read, adults with COVID-19 about twice as likely to say they have dined at a restaurant. Now, if you've ever done research, you know that correlation is not the same as causation. What this means is that people aren't necessarily getting COVID at restaurants, but it could mean that adults who admit to eating out at restaurants are also maybe a little more relaxed in their overall feelings about COVID. Maybe they don't take the same precautions, or they may take more risk than others who don't dine out. So when we read, we need to stop and think about contradictions and logic. Critical thinkers also draw appropriate distinctions. They avoid extremes, and they exercise foresight. This is interesting. Foresight is the ability to look ahead and consider future possibilities. Bias prevents you from being objective. You need to present factual information and informed assertions that are supported with credible evidence. So avoiding bias when you're writing means that you need to write in the third person, almost always. You want to avoid using the word I, because once you say I, you're putting yourself in this situation. Avoid using the word you, because now you sound like you're preaching or you're writing a self-help book. Avoid your personal feelings, which you can do if you take out the word I a lot of times. You need to be specific. So if there is a statistic that you can use it. Don't say things like a lot or most or an alarming number of people if you can put a number on it. Use people first language. That means don't say the disabled child. The child with a disability is people first. See, he's a child. He's a child first. His disability is not the definition of him. Just over the past few years, gender neutral phrases and pronouns have become acceptable. So it's preferable to use they and them instead of he, she, or her, him. And that used to be grammatically incorrect, but it isn't anymore. So these are some examples of biased statements. Like I said before, the disabled boy enrolled in the geography class. What would be better is to say the boy with autism enrolled in the geography class, and only if the autism is an important piece of what you're writing about. If it doesn't matter if he had autism, then you don't need to say it. All reporters report accurately on the news. Probably not. Most reporters do their best to report accurately on the news. Okay, that's probably a little bit less biased. Precision is essential in scholarly writing. When you refer to a person or persons, choose words that are accurate, clear, and free from bias or prejudicial connotations. Bias, like inaccurate or unclear language, can be a form of imprecision. So for example, using man to refer to all human beings is not as accurate or inclusive as using the term individuals or people or persons. So my mom told my sister and I this story the other day about our cousin, who's a girl, becoming a fireman. And we laughed and we said, "You mean firefighter?" Now, my mom is 76 years old, so I'm going to give her a pass, but we should try to adjust our language to avoid bias whenever we can. Being informed means reading all the perspectives, even when you don't like them. It means looking at what may not be popular to you and what may not be interesting to reach the kind of conclusions that you need to reach. If you've been given an assignment and the instructor has provided you with several articles to read to complete your assignment, a good rule of thumb is still to conduct your own research. The easy way is just to read what's been given to you. But if you want to gather your own information to ensure you're getting the full picture, it's always good to read a little more. I mean, you will never say to yourself, "Why did I read and conduct thorough research? What a waste of my time." You're not ever going to say that. So let's talk about credible resources for your research. Many libraries, schools, and universities have electronic databases. Look for a database link on your local library or your school website and check out things like ProQuest and ERIC for scholarly articles. And you can also look through the New York Times archives, which has historical sources. And use primary sources. So this means use the original document and not someone else's summary of it. If you read someone's summary of something and you think, wow, that's really good information, then go and find that original source. Look at the domain suffix. This means that if it is a .edu, a .gov, or .org, in general, these are reliable sources on the web, but beware of political sites used to sway public opinion. Use these sites with caution, checking for credibility and authority. Company websites generally end in .com. And these sites are great for information about a particular company. However, be aware that company websites are used to promote. So be sure that the information is non-biased. While many professional organizations end in .org, there are also many .orgs that are biased and promote a specific agenda. So just make sure that your critical thinking cap is on and you read these sources with a focus on what might be biased. Use Wikipedia. Now, you probably think, what? I've been told I can't use Wikipedia, but you can use it in a more awesome way. Over the years, Wikipedia has become more and more reliable as a general source of information, thanks to its large audience of readers, and it has rigorous editorial guidelines. But many educators still don't want you to use it as a source in your paper. So here's what you do. You can go to Wikipedia and scroll down to the references page, which is all the way down at the bottom of an entry. And there you will find all kinds of source material. And these resources will very easily be related to your topic. Sometimes they have links to the sources themselves. And that's a good place to start. This is true of any resource. If you find a good scholarly article, go to its reference page and see if you can find additional articles for your topic. Use the titles, the journal titles, or the author to search for those in your online library or in Google Scholar. If you've never tried Google Scholar, it's a great database of research-based materials. And also check the dates of your source. If you're citing something that's more than 5 or 10 years old, it's no longer credible. More research has likely been done. The world has probably changed. Issues have changed. The only time, of course, that's not applicable is if you're citing your primary sources. So obviously, if you're citing the Declaration of Independence, it's not going to change. And examine the author's credentials. If you're not sure whether the author is a credible source, look them up, see what they do, and then go with your instinct. Sources that are probably not credible: opinion or op-ed pieces and editorials. If you notice all caps and exclamation points, it's probably not credible. Or if the website seems primitive and not professional, it's probably not. Now, this is a joke, but I used to tell my high school students, if it's called Tom's website, it's not credible. Articles that are just a paragraph, also probably not credible. And if you sense there is persuasion, someone's trying to convince you of something, even if it's not outwardly called an editorial, it probably still is. Remember, they're playing on your emotions. And remember the big picture. Sometimes when we are reading articles for research, we get narrowly focused on issues within issues within issues. It's like going down this rabbit hole. Remember the larger issue at hand so you can keep your perspective. We talked about finding credible sources, so now let's talk about how you actually use them. After you introduce evidence into your writing or your presentation, you must say why and how this evidence supports your argument. In other words, you have to explain the significance of the evidence and its function in your paper. As writers, we sometimes assume that our readers already know what we're talking about, and we might be like, oh, I don't want to elaborate too much because this is obvious. But readers can't read our minds. Although they may be familiar with many of the ideas we are discussing, they don't know what we're really trying to do with those ideas unless we indicate it through explanations, organization of our paper, good transitions, and so forth. So try to spell out the connections that you're making in your mind when you choose your evidence and when you decide where you're going to place it in your paper. So here's some good questions to ask yourself when writing and determining where your evidence should go. I've just stated this point, but so what? Why is it interesting? Why should anyone care? There's your evidence. What does this information imply? What are the consequences of thinking this way or looking at a problem this way? I've just described what something is like or how I see it, but why is it like that? I've just said something happens. How does it happen? How does it come to be the way that it is? How is this idea related to my thesis? This is something I see a lot of times with students I teach, is that they don't always see the connections that exist between their paragraphs and their thesis. You have to always go back. Does it support your thesis? And how does it do that? Can I give an example to illustrate this point I just made. So every time you draw a conclusion, check that you have evidence to do so. Remember that every claim needs evidence. So how do you know if you have enough? Well, I usually conduct all of my research before I start to write or plan out a presentation. I like to have the big picture. What do I know? What am I going to say? What are my claims? And how do I back it all up with credible evidence? So if I'm trying to make a claim that there is no evidence to support, well then I know before I even waste time writing anything at all, I am on the wrong track. And this also helps me to check my own bias and my own assumptions before I begin the writing process. Then once I have all of that clearly defined, I start writing. I have talked about color-coded notes before, but it's so worth repeating. I color code my notes and I do it by paragraph, because usually each paragraph is a new claim. So if my first paragraph is my first claim, I might color code all of my notes for that claim in blue. My second paragraph notes might all be purple. My notes for my third paragraph might all be pink. Then when I look at my notes after I finished all of my research, I can easily see what paragraphs need some work. If I have hardly any pink in my notes, then I immediately know.
Could you try?
Then I immediately know that I might not have enough evidence to support my claim in my third paragraph. So I'll show you an example of my notes in just a second. Here's a very simple way to write a paragraph. Start with your claim. What's the point of your paragraph? Then use evidence to support it. What does the research tell you about this? What can you insert into your paragraph to really make your case? Then use reasoning. Reasoning is how you tie it all together. Why is it important and how does it all connect? So before we go too far down the road of what it means to provide evidence, we should talk about the right way to support your ideas. Plagiarism is the wrong way to support your ideas. Plagiarism is taking someone else's work or ideas and passing them off as your own. If you didn't make it up and pull it out of your own brain, then it is someone else's. 40% of undergrad and grad students admit to cheating on written assignments. That can mean that they don't cite something properly, or it can mean what I discovered recently in one of my classes was my students submitted their paper through Tutor.com, and my student's paper was an exact copy of a paper from another student who submitted it this semester before. Now, that's downright stupid if your instructor uses a plagiarism detection program like Turnitin. You'll never get away with that kind of blatant cheating. But what I really see more often is a student who submits full sentences or full paragraphs from a website without citing that information, without putting quotes around it. Many, many times we plagiarize by accident. We have to be careful not to do these things. So I have a friend who turned in parts of a paper in 2 different classes. Same paper, 2 different classes, 2 different instructors. She had no idea there was something called self-plagiarism. She thought they were her own thoughts, so she had the right to use them. But she was wrong, and she got in big trouble and almost got expelled. You should not use even your own written words for more than 1 class without making sure that it's acceptable. And when I say acceptable, just ask your instructor if it's okay. Another way we plagiarize is by reading something and forgetting that we read it. This happens when we forget to cite it in our own notes. So we read something and we think, wow, that's really good. And we add it into our notes and we think about it some more, and maybe a few days go by, and then we sit down to write our paper, and that thought has now become ingrained in our process. Somewhere along the line, it just comes out perfectly in what we are writing. And we've forgotten that it originally came from something that we read. So here's how we can avoid that accident. We can be very careful of the cut and paste. Now, I like cutting and pasting directly from my source into my notes, but not directly into my paper. Before any cutting and pasting into my notes, I always ensure that my source is listed. That way I remember, no matter how many days go by between my note-taking and my writing, that I did not come up with those ideas by myself. I also wrote out my reference page, or same thing, I call it reference page. You might call it a works cited page or a bibliography. It's all the same. I used to write that out first. I still do that actually. In fact, many times I wrote out my reference page, then included the full reference in my notes, just like you see here, just to make sure I didn't accidentally plagiarize. And I usually also included the citation. This way, when I go to put the information in my own words, I can cite it quickly. So just to reiterate, these are my notes. The colors are paragraphs. The references are what go into the last page of my written document, my reference page, my works cited or bibliography. And then that little Sing 213 that you see there, that's my citation. That's what goes into the body of my paragraph when I use those ideas from those notes. So that brings me to paraphrasing versus quoting. Pet peeve I have. You should paraphrase most of the time. It flows better. It shows that you've been able to take the information in, process it, and put it into your own words in just the right place in your paper. Paraphrase if the information you are presenting is unlikely to be questioned, which should be most of what you are presenting. Quoting throughout your paper can come across as choppy, and it also sends the message that you might have taken the easy way out, because it's a lot easier to drop quotes all throughout your paper than it is to actually paraphrase. On the other hand, you should paraphrase or you should quote if you can't say it any better than how the author stated it. If their words are just so profound or witty and you cannot say it any better than that, and it will have a much bigger impact if quoted word for word, then okay, quote. Also, if you are taking a very unique position that relies on the reader's understanding of exactly what that writer said about the topic, then quoting might be most appropriate. Just be sure that when you're quoting something, you use proper transitions and phrases leading up to and out of the quote to make it flow into the rest of your paper, and also to provide the appropriate amount of context. Regardless of if you quote or paraphrase, you still need a citation. Remember that if you didn't make it up, it's plagiarism, no matter how you provide it in your paper. If you don't include that parenthetical documentation, that parentheses, and then where you put the author or the date or however you're supposed to do it, the citation is the key to showing this is not mine. I didn't make this up. And I should point out that the citation looks different if you have to use MLA or APA or Chicago, whatever you're supposed to use for your school. It's going to look a little different, probably different than what I just showed you because I only do APA. And the citation will most likely look different if you paraphrase versus if you cite. So just make sure you know the difference. So this webinar has been all about critical thinking and research skills. How do they tie together and where does plagiarism come in? Well, it's all about being an educated, well-read student and understanding that as you become a critical thinker, you will question what you read and hear, and you will formulate a stance on the issues by analyzing the facts. You will use the research and ideas you've gained from reading and watching videos to formulate a solid argument. In that process, you need to remember that the information is not yours. And that's what academic integrity is all about. Kind of as a side note, Tutor.com has a writing center that many of our writing tutors have helped me create. We are adding to this site regularly, and we feel it has some really simple, easy to follow articles about all kinds of things like citations, writing paragraphs. We have one on when to use commas, different types of essays and how they should be structured, and lots more. It's free and it's open for you to use anytime. So back to our checklist for critical thinking. Step 1, become a critical thinker. Step 2 is be educated and well-read. Step 3 is just know you have biases and avoid showing them. And then think about your assumptions. Find credible evidence. Make sure you cite your evidence. Take proper notes. Paraphrase as much as you can and quote sparingly. So to practice what I preach, this is my reference page that I produced before I started this. And if you have any questions, I'm going to send it back to Lauren so we can answer them.
Thanks, Amy. That was really helpful refresher course for all of us who have not been in school in a while, like myself.
Yeah.
You can use it even in your everyday life and how you even approach your job every day, making sure that you are thinking through things and not just sort of, you know, come in with your own bias and just answering without all the informed information. So it's smart practice kind of for lifelong learning and growing. Okay, everyone, at this point, we're going to start moving into our Q&A section where we're going to take your questions and have Amy address them with a little bit of commentary from me where applicable. But before we do that, and go ahead and start populating them in the question box on your control panel. Before we do that, we do want to encourage you to sign up for our social media channels and follow us, because we post about all of the events that we host for students, for parents, for job seekers, for teachers, for clients. We post about those events on our social channels, so it's a good way to have that information and find out what's coming next. Additionally, all of these sessions get recorded and posted to our YouTube channel. So that link you see on the screen, Tutor.com/YouTube webinars, we post all of these sessions there, and they're there for you kind of after the session ends, but also I know many of you work with students or have colleagues and peers that might benefit from this and maybe couldn't attend. You can share that YouTube channel and they can see any of these sessions that Amy has hosted, as well as other topics we've hosted with some of our other team members. So I'm seeing some questions come in. One other thing I just wanted to sort of plug here. This is the last session of our Student Success Series this fall. They've been popular, so we will probably look to host them again at some point and maybe even come up with some new topics. But we'd love to hear from all of you who've attended this session and or other sessions about if there's any topics that you would think we could maybe put on that would help you or help your students. So if you want to put those into the question box too, we will consider them as we plan our future programming. I think some of our next couple sessions, just as a teaser, will be about parents and parent coaching during this time. And Amy's going to host that session too. That'll be coming towards the end of October. And then Marcus, who's helping with some of the technical questions here, is probably going to be working on, with one of our colleagues, some information and web sessions for job seekers in the next couple months. So those are some topics on the docket. Okay, Amy, let's see what we have for questions.
Okay.
So, quite a few coming in, so bear with me and we'll try to get through as many as we can. So what role does listening play in critical thinking? Can one listen to himself, herself, / herself?
Huh. Well, I'm trying to think of what that question is really asking. Can one listen to himself or herself? I think that this person is saying, can you listen to, you know, kind of what?
I take it as your own intuition to some degree. There we go.
Okay, yeah. That's what I was hoping. I was hoping that's what it was. Listening to your own intuition. I mean, absolutely, that's part of critical thinking. But that's not the only part, but that might be the first part. You know, you listen to something, you hear something, you think, my intuition tells me that might not be true. I'm going to go and do some more research. Or that my intuition tells me that that's true. That sounds logical. I'm following it to the conclusion. I'm listening all the way to what, you know, my instincts are telling me, and that's telling me that's true. But that doesn't mean you stop there. You still should go and do further research. And I don't mean everything in everyday life, every little thing you hear. You're not constantly Googling everything, but you are as a student. As a student, you're questioning everything. You really can't listen to your own intuition every time, because we know we have biases. We know we have assumptions. We know they're already there. And there's nothing wrong with it, because it's just part of our human nature, you know, the way we were brought up, the things we've learned in our lives, our political affiliation, you know, where we live, all of these things influence us, and that's okay. It's just good to know it's there and say, wait a second, my instinct is, yeah, I want to believe this, and I think that sounds logical. But if I'm going to present that in any way academically, I need to still go back to the research and see what the experts are saying, what the scientists are saying, whatever it might be, what the college professors out there are saying, because college professors conduct a lot of research at a lot of schools. And if I can listen to what they're saying, and that also is, you know, confirming what I thought, well, then I'm onto something.
I think it's also important to listen to others, and you, Amy said this, you may not agree with everything that they say, but there may be some new information that you didn't have that informs your work, right? Or informs your opinion. You should be open to listening to what other people have to say. I think we don't always do enough of that. So listen to yourself and listen to others.
That's true. If nothing else, it just brings up more questions for you to go look at, you know, just makes you think harder.
Definitely. Here's a good one. How do you narrow down your references quickly? So some people, there's so much information out there on particular topics. How do you start to narrow the focus?
Well, if you're researching like in, you know, some kind of scholarly database, or you're in your online library and you've done some research, you know, you can ask your librarian to help you narrow down your search terms. That's one thing that I always would find. I would do a search and I'd go, oh, that's too big. I came up with, you know, 12,000 articles. Okay, that's not going to work. So then I would add another phrase or another word to it. And you can get really good. And the more you do this, the better you'll get at it as to how to figure out which search terms you should use. So one way is just to keep adding words that you can search. That'll help narrow it down. Okay, I had 12,000. I added the word leadership. Now I have, you know, 8,000. Still too many. Okay, what else do I want to say? So that's something that librarians are really good at teaching you, helping you do. So I definitely recommend you reach out to them. And then the other thing you do is at that point, you do look at just the titles of articles, okay? And that helps you to eliminate. And if you see one that you think, this looks like it might be right, you click on it, read the abstract. Read the abstract of that article. That will help you even more go, okay, the abstract is basically a summary of what this article has. And that'll help you narrow down a little further. And that way you don't actually waste time reading entire articles. And then the other thing you can do, which I recommend, if you get one of those articles that's like 50 pages, right, and it's a whole research study that someone conducted, and there's all kinds of statistics and, you know, jargon in there, is just scroll down to the bottom where they kind of summarize what the study found. And then that'll help you also determine whether or not this article is for you, whether it's going to give you what you need.
I think one of the things that we've talked about in a couple of the sessions, and you just spoke to it a little bit here, Amy, is use your resources. So we've talked about this related to tutoring. We've talked about it as related to some of the other support that's out there. But your librarians, and we work with tons of librarians across the country, right? Through public libraries, through academic libraries. They are so good at helping with all of this. This is what they do day in, day out, and can really help be a great sort of traffic cop for you, or tour guide through your search. So, you know, leverage the resources that you have. You don't have to do it alone, and they often can really get you to the right places and kind of help you with those searches. So that's kind of my big tip. I always used the library when I was in school, and I was an English major and a film major, and I had to do a lot of critical thinking and probably what some people would say is overthinking about how every little detail of a film was constructed, for example, and then relate it to history. So I was in the library all the time, and my librarians were so helpful just getting me to the right shelf in that case. But in this case, in the online realm, they can really help you sort of figure out some really good areas of focus.
Yeah, the right database, the right, you know, journal. Sometimes I would just search particular journals because I knew that journal was focused on a, you know, a particular subject that I was looking at. So if I could just narrow down, you know, that far, that was super helpful. And your librarians know that stuff.
One question is, why do people think Wikipedia is not reliable?
Well, because it used to be that anybody long ago could just go in and make edits. I mean, they didn't really have credible people editing it. And that was, back in the day when Wikipedia was newer. And now that's not exactly the case. And I don't know exactly how you can edit Wikipedia, what qualifications you have to have, but I know it's more rigorous than it used to be. So that was one thing. They also used to, if anybody can change something and write something about, maybe you're researching a particular person and anybody can go in there. Obviously it's going to be biased. I'm going to say what I want to say about this person. So there was some of that going on. So a lot of professors and, high school teachers immediately said, no, don't want you using that. But like I said, it's a little bit more acceptable now. So I would say that, you have to ask, definitely ask. Some professors will say, yeah, use Wikipedia. But if not, you can still use it to help guide you. Like we said, narrowing down your focus. If you could find the Wikipedia page that has everything you want, scroll to their references, and that's where you start.
Next question. If I begin a class, then drop it, but had to retake it later and used my old work, is that plagiarism or cheating?
That's great. I thought someone might ask that question. So it's self-plagiarism. I mean, technically, but it's not necessarily, you aren't necessarily going to get in trouble for it if you ask. So here's what I had happen. I had a student who took my class and dropped it, I think in like week 6. It was a 7-week course. So this person did most of the work, and then something happened and he had to leave. So he came back in the next quarter and he said, I already did all the work. Is it okay if I resubmit the same assignments? And my answer to him, and this is where you have to talk to your instructor, my answer to him was, I don't mind if you submit the same assignments, but I want you to go back and go through all the comments that I gave you and all the suggestions and everything that I gave you on those assignments, and I want you to fix those things. So I want to see a better version of what you originally did. And he took it very seriously, and I said, I'm going to compare your 2 assignments, and it shows up in Turnitin.com. So super easy for me to pull up both versions and see exactly what he did and what he changed. And because he was forced to go back and make some changes, he even caught things that I didn't tell him to change, just said, oh, I could probably do this better, and really ended up acing the class. So for me, I allowed him to do that, but he asked. Now you have to ask your professor. Some professors are going to say, no, I don't want you doing the same thing. And it depends on the class. This was, not a super, super heavy academic research class. So that's why it worked best for us in that situation. But in some classes, your professor's going to want you to do all new research and start over again. So it would be considered self-plagiarism if you don't check.
I think one thing to know about that too is that it doesn't mean that your work is lost forever. As long as you're picking topics, as long as you can, right? Your instructors sometimes give you topics that you have to work within parameters, but I always liked personally to pick something I was deeply passionate or interested in or curious about, so that it wasn't going to be a boring thing for me to have to read a lot about, right? And then some of that work I actually took with me even beyond school and just have done for my own personal life or my own interest. And some people that I went to school with even took some of the work that they had done and they published or they presented at conferences because that was their passion project. So it doesn't mean it's always lost work either, even if you can't use it again too.
That's true. And I told you the story about the glass ceiling presentation I gave. Well, I gave that as a freshman in college. And then I redid that presentation and used the same research, went and found some more, totally rearranged, made sure it wasn't biased and whatever, presented it again my senior year. So, that all that research didn't go to waste. I learned my lesson about, persuasion versus argument. So there you go. You can still sometimes use that again.
Mm-hmm. One question here is, it's broader than just academics, but how do you practice critical thinking skills on a daily basis? And I think the first is Amy and I were chatting earlier today, and it's, social media is great for a lot of things, but, it's the worst place in the world to some degree for critical thinking skills, right? Just reading a tweet or reading somebody's Facebook post and like 3 sentences of a headline without diving into the actual article. So my tip is, don't believe necessarily everything you have on social media until you dive into it a little bit. That would help with everyday life. But you're the expert here. What do you think?
Oh gosh. Well, yeah, I'll tell you a little story of how I'm trying to teach this to my son, who's 16, and he loves watching like funny videos of, people commentating on a speech or something like, or debate or whatever. And he watches this, and they cut and paste different things, and then they say funny things about it, and he thinks it's hilarious, and that's fine. But then he takes it as truth. And sometimes I have to say, but wait a second, did they cut that part out of a presentation? Was it the whole presentation or just this piece of it? Oh, well, they just took, the sound bites, right? It was funny. Okay, that's great. And you can laugh at that. But if you really want to make a judgment, about what that speech really entailed, you have to go watch the whole speech, or at least watch that whole section of that speech. Don't just take the sound bites. So that's one thing I recommend if you really want to be a critical thinker. Just in the news today, we just hear lots of little bits of things. Oh, someone said this, and it's really only a small part of what they said. So be careful of that. That means go and find the whole thing. Go read the whole speech or the whole article. Don't just look at the headline. The headline, like we talked about the COVID people and eating out at restaurants, that was an article, and I heard it on the news. And for both, I thought that doesn't mean anything. What is it? What are we really saying? So I went and read the article, and the article still didn't really talk about the difference between correlation and causation the way that I really thought it was important to say. So I drew my own conclusions there. But point is, just look at more and more. Like if you hear something, go see if you can find it and you can read about it. If you see something, see if there's, an alternative thought out there. Is one, or, sometimes you can look up and see are 4 or 5 different news outlets telling the same story. That's probably pretty reliable, probably, but check to make sure, what's liberal, what's not, I don't know, that stuff is tricky. So I just think question everything you hear and read as much as you can is really the best advice I can always give.
Yeah, and just to be fair, the headlines may not always tell the whole story, but if you actually click into the article, and I do this all the time myself, where I read the headlines, keep scrolling, dive into the article, read the article if it's something that piques your interest, or maybe bothers you because you don't like how it's phrased, because usually there's documentation. It'll be well sourced or not when you actually read the story. I find a lot of the stories actually are very well sourced, even if maybe the person who is not the journalist who wrote the headline did it sort of for clickbait. So I'm not trying to undermine news sources. I just keep reading.
That's true. A lot of times there are a lot of good facts in there. That's true.
Okay, let's see. Is a biased primary source more reliable than an unbiased secondary source?
Ooh, that is a tough one.
I thought that was tough too.
A biased primary source more reliable than an unbiased. I would tend to say no, but I guess it really just depends on the situation. It's critical thinking, reading through and seeing what was going on in the world, or who wrote the primary source. There's still bias out there, absolutely true, but they're more acceptable primary sources than secondary sources. So but that's tricky. I would say you still always want to look for bias, and I think a lot of times if you can find a secondary source that's unbiased, it's probably better. There's probably a college professor that just asked me that question, and they're going, no, you're wrong. That was a good question.
It's a tough one. Yeah. We need to do a little research and critical thinking after this session on that question. So.
Really, I really do.
Okay, we only have time for 1, maybe 2 more, but one of the questions is related to TED Talk, and I want to bring that to you just because I think podcasts and, you know, sources like that have become even more popular for people to get some information from. So how do you sort of avoid plagiarizing when you agree or disagree with what a speaker is saying, and how do you connect it to your paper?
Well, I think TED Talks are just a really good way to kind of creatively give you inspiration, right? So I wouldn't say a TED Talk is a great source to use, but it's a great start. So if you listen to a TED Talk and it's all about why, you know, time management is important, and there are some out there, then you might say, okay, they give me some really good ideas, and now I'm going to further that. I'm going to do more research, and now I'm going to, this is what I want my topic to be, but now I need to find the right sources to support the topic. Some instructors say you can cite a TED Talk as a reference, and that's fine, but it should never be the only reference. And some will say no, not at all, but they're still valuable. I mean, TED Talks no doubt are inspirational, no doubt will give you ideas. So then you just take those and you further that research by looking at what are the experts saying. I mean, TED Talks are obviously opinion based. You know, these are people telling their stories about, you know, things they've lived through, but some of them are the actual experts in the subject. Some of them are. And so if that's the actual expert that went out and did the research and they're presenting that research in a TED Talk in some way, then that's pretty good. But what else did they say about it? What else did they write? What else? What do other people say? And then you just keep going from there. I think that's just the only thing is what a lot of times we watch a good video and we stop. That was really good, and that's it. Okay, I'm just going to write a paper about what that person said. No, you have to keep going. That's the hard part, is just to keep reading.
Okay, there's a couple other questions here, but I think we're getting kind of close to the end of our time. So we're going to go ahead and wrap for today. Thank you again for everyone attending the sessions throughout the fall. If you've attended multiple ones or watched our recordings, we've gotten a lot of good feedback, as we said, and we're excited to kind of come up with some new ideas. So if you want to send us an email, I got a few suggestions through the question box here, but we're always looking for additional ways that we can support students. Of course, Tutor.com provides tutoring, and many of you have access to Tutor.com for free through your library, school, college, employer, government, military programs. So many of you already have access to tutoring, but we do like to do these sessions just to help learners, parents, teachers, those of you on the front lines working with students in student services and in libraries, for example. So any topics that come to mind, please let us know, because we are always going to be looking at ways we can help with these kinds of sessions. So thank you again for attending. Thank you again to Amy for running some really awesome workshops over the past several weeks, and we hope to see you again soon. Have a really great weekend.